for the specific special right triangle when we're talking about the shortcut. So the first type of special right triangle you guys kind of noticed in your homework was the 45, 45, 90 triangle. The reason why the 45, 45, 90 triangle is nice is because if you've got two congruent angles, then you know that you're going to have two congruent legs. So here's our 45, 45, 90 triangle theorem. It states in a 45 degree, 90 degree triangle, both legs are congruent and the length of the hypotenuse is the square root of 2 times the length of the leg. So on your homework, you did a whole bunch of problems where you were given a leg, so 11, 11, then you did your Pythagorean theorem to get x squared, then this ended up being 11 square roots of 2. And if the same thing, if it was 3 and 3, then this ended up being 3 square roots of 2. If this was 4 and 4, then this ended up being 4 square roots of 2. That's just how it works, because this would be 16 plus 16, which is 32. When you simplify the square root of 32, you do 16 and 2, which gets you to 4 square roots of 2. Okay, so in a 45, 45, 90 triangle, we know that both legs are going to be congruent. So if we want to mark up this diagram up here, I know that both legs are going to be, let's say, x, which then means that my hypotenuse will be x times the square root of 2. Okay, so off to this left space here, to go from leg to hypotenuse, you multiply by the square root of 2. What would you do if you had to go from hypotenuse to leg? It will be the opposite of that. Divide, which you guys just did a whole bunch of dividings by the square root of 2, right? That's what we just did for practice. So to go from hypotenuse to leg, you're going to divide by the square root of 2. Okay. So if you were to make an index card or a piece of paper for your next assessment, which I will allow you to do, these might be 2 good things to put on that sheet of paper. Okay, so for a 45, 45, 90 triangle, to go from leg to hypotenuse, we're going to multiply by the square root of 2. To go from hypotenuse to leg, we're going to divide by the square root of 2. All right, so let's go to the first example here. We need to solve for h. I see 45, 45, 90. So that means that my legs are congruent. It's not asking me for a leg, it's asking me for the length of the hypotenuse. So how do I get the hypotenuse? I take the leg and I multiply it by the square root of 2, which 9 times the square root of 2 is just 9 square root 2. So h would be equal to 9 square root 2. I'm going to get any trickier than that. We look at the second one. We're solving for x. Is x a leg or a hypotenuse? Is the hypotenuse still opposite that right angle? So my leg length is what? Good. So I'm going to take my leg length, I'm going to multiply it by the square root of 2. So my leg is 2 square roots of 2, which then I'm going to multiply by a square root of 2. So what does that get me? And the square root of 4 is, so we get 2 times the square root of 4, which really is 2 times 2, which would be 4. Good. So x is equal to 4. Okay. So leg 2 hypotenuse, we're multiplying the leg value by the square root of 2. Now in this case, my hypotenuse is given to me as 6. Now I need to solve for a leg. So how do I go from hypotenuse to leg? I'm going to divide. So x is equal to, why did I do that? 6 divided by the square root of 2. Well, we just practiced this. What do I do to rationalize that? Multiply by the square root of 2 on the top and the bottom. So then we get 6 square root of 2 over 2. So if I had 6 square roots of 2 and cut them in half, I'd be left with how many square roots of 2? 3. So x is equal to 3 square roots of 2. Okay? So that's your 45, 45, 90. Which is going to be the easiest of the 2 special right triangles. So again, on your next quiz, on your next test, I'm going to let you have a little index card specifically for the quiz. Maybe the test will give you a piece of paper where you can write whatever you want on there as long as it's not specific examples. And I would put those little writings. Leg to hypotenuse. Multiply the leg by the square root of 2. Hypotenuse to leg. Divide the hypotenuse by the square root of 2. Okay? All right, so on to the back. 30, 60, 90. Gets a little bit more tricky. So go ahead and write this first, and then we can dive into it a little bit better. So your 30, 60, 90 triangle theorem states that the length of the hypotenuse is twice the length of the shorter leg and the length of the longer leg is square root 3 times the length of the shorter leg. And go ahead and make that diagram of that right triangle off to the side, wherever you have space. So the length of the hypotenuse is twice the length of the shorter leg. The length of the longer leg is the square root of 3 times the length of the shorter leg. All right, so unlike a 45, 45, 90, where we had 2 congruent legs, that made life really easy. So if this leg was 9, that leg was 9. Then we just have to get to the hypotenuse by multiplying by the square root of 2, so it'd be 9 square roots of 2. What's a little bit more difficult here is you've got 2 different things happening. So I'm going to flip away from the screen and then I'll come back to it. So we could just watch up here quickly. I'm going to make a triangle up here, and I want you to tell me what type of triangle you would call it. What type of triangle would that be? Equilateral. Why do I know that it's equilateral? All the sides are the same. If it's equilateral, what would be the degree of all the angles? So 180 divided by 3, so they would all be 60 degrees, right? So equilateral means all the angles are the same. If all the angles are the same, they're all 60 degrees. If I were to sketch in the altitude, that would hit at the midpoint here and here. So now, what happened to this top angle? Get rid of this. It's split in half. So what would each half be? Well, if the whole thing was 60, now each of them would be 30. So now look what happens to half of my triangle. Doesn't that become a 30, 60, 90 triangle? And this short leg is what relation to the now hypotenuse? Half of it, right? Because half of it was the whole entire side of the triangle. This whole thing was equal to the hypotenuse. If I cut it in half to make it into a right triangle, so it's half the hypotenuse. That's where that comes from. So if we go back to this diagram here, hopefully you have that triangle in there. If my short leg, and your shorter leg will always, always, always be opposite the smaller angle. 30 degrees is smaller than 60. So my short leg right now is down here at the bottom. If my short leg, let's say, is x, the hypotenuse would be double that value, so 2x. Because this is half of the whole side. And then the tricky part is the length of the longer leg, which will be opposite the 60-degree angle, is your short leg times the square root of 3. The way that I memorize that is 30, 60, 90 are all multiples of 3, so that's why it's the square root of 3, as opposed to the square root of 2, which is our 45, 45, 90. There you have two congruent legs. Okay? So 2x, x square root of 3. Those are your rules. So if we wanted to make little notations like we did the last time, if I want to go from short to hypotenuse, whoops, that's pretty high up there. Let's get rid of that. Shift it down a second. Can you see that? Yeah. Short to hypotenuse, what do? We take the short leg and multiply it by 2. Does that make sense if I write it like that? Or if you want to write the words multiply by 2, multiply the short by 2, however you want to write it, that's up to you. So if you want to go in reverse from hypotenuse to short, what would you do? So you would take your hypotenuse and divide by 2, right? If I had this, if this was 10, this would be 5. If this was 12, this would be 6. This was 20, this would be 10. Okay? So it's easiest movement between these two. Now let's go in this direction. If I have to go from short to long leg, what do? We take the short and we multiply the short leg by the square root of 3. So if I needed to go in reverse, what would we do? If I went long to short, instead of multiplying by the square root of 3, we would take our long and divide it by the square root of 3, which you guys have just done before we started our notes today. Okay, so again, on your index card, on your sheet of paper, these might be some smart things to put on there. So I want to put stars next to it or whatever, saying use this on your note card. Okay, so let's go ahead and try these out. Here we go. So number 1, we need to first decide what everything represents. Here I have an x, here I have a y. My x right now is representing what? A leg or a hypotenuse? A leg. Is it the longer leg or the shorter leg? The longer leg. 6 would be the shorter leg. Y would be the hypotenuse. So this one's an easy one. It's always going to be easiest when they give you the short leg. Then it's not as much work to get to everything. So how do I go from short leg to long leg? So to solve for x, short to long, what are we doing? We're taking the short and multiplying it by square root of 3. So x would just be equal to 6 square roots of 3. Up here for y, to go from short to hypotenuse, what are we doing? Multiplying it by 2, which gets us to 12. So y would be equal to 12. So given a short leg, that's going to be the easiest scenario for a 30, 60, 90. All right, let's look at the next one and see what's happening. Now they're putting 6 where? On the hypotenuse. All right, so now I got to work a little bit backwards. So if I'm given a hypotenuse, my only method is to go from hypotenuse to short. Notice we did not write anything up there about hypotenuse to long, because you can't go directly from a hypotenuse to a long. Everything needs to connect back to the short. So how do we go from a hypotenuse to a short? Hypotenuse divided by 2, which would be 3. So x is equal to 3, which is now my short. So now how do we go from short to long? We multiply by the square root of 3. Good. So your short leg, which we said it was 3, multiplied by the square root of 3. Okay. So they're all shortcuts, just being able to get to them very quickly. All right, next one. So now they're giving us 5. Which leg is that one located on? That one's now on the long, which is probably the hardest scenario when they start with the long. Unless it already has a square root of 3 attached to it, then that's kind of nice because then that just cancels out. But in this case, it's not. So we don't have anything that tells us how to go directly to long to hypotenuse. Everything needs to connect back to the short. So D is the short. So how do we go from long to short? Divide. So take your long and divide it by the square root of 3, which means we need to rationalize that. Multiply by the square root of 3 in both the top and the bottom. So that means D is equal to 5 square root 3 over 3. How do we go from short to hypotenuse? Multiply the short, which is 5 square root of 3 over 3, times 2. So how do we do that math? Well, I can turn 2 into a fraction by putting it over 1. Multiply straight through. What are you going to end up in your denominator? 3 times 1 is 3, so I'll have 3 in my denominator. Here I have a 5 that does not have a square root sign over it. Here I have a 2 that does not have a square root over it. So I'm going to multiply my 5 and 2 together to make 10. And the square root of 3 will just come along for the ride. Okay? That's probably the hardest type of problem that we would end up with. If this problem originally was, instead of 5 square roots of 3, then what would happen, let me get rid of all this. Can I get rid of the rest of this? So then when you went back to the short and did 5 square roots of 3 divided by the square roots of 3, these would just cancel out, and then you'd be left with just 5. So then D would be 5, which would make F double that, so 10. Okay? Think you got that? All right, let's do the word problem at the end here. We got our moose warning sign, which is an equilateral triangle. The height is 1 meter. So you either can sketch inside of that or just make a new triangle. So equilateral. Height in the middle is 1. Find the length of each side of the sign. So if I'm trying to find each length of the side, I'm looking for X. So if I cut this in half, which special right triangle do we end up with? 45, 45, 90 or 30, 60, 90? 30, 60, 90, where 60 is here, 30 is up top. So that number 1 is on the hypotenuse or a leg? The leg, the long or the short leg? The long leg. So before I get to the hypotenuse, I have to find that short. So how do we go from long to short? Divide by the square root of 3, which means we need to rationalize it. So multiply by the square root of 3, top and bottom. So that gets me the square root of 3 over 3. So now how do we go from short to hypotenuse? Yeah, so it would be square root of 3 over 3 times 2, which would just be 2 square roots of 3 over 3. So that would be our exact answer. It said find the length of each side of the sign to the nearest tenth. So I would put this into my calculator. So I would do a 2 times the square root of 3. And then whatever that product is, divide it by 3. Which gets me approximately, are we rounding to the tenth? So 1.2. So 1.2 meters will be our final answer, which makes sense because 1.2 is larger than 1 and your hypotenuse should be the longest side. Okay? All right, so